and Suleiman's in charge of that, so kind of a good person. But try to learn something about it. Say the Wisner rule. Well, Israel and the United States have a program for the West Bank and Gaza, and have had for years. You can see it developing in front of your eyes. Israel now controls about over 40% of the West Bank. The program that's being implemented, which basically comes from General Ariel Sharon, the main expansionist, was described by Prime Minister Olmert, past Prime Minister, as what he called convergence. Israel will take over whatever is valuable, essentially. That includes the land behind what's called the separation wall, actually an annexation wall. It's a wall that snakes through Palestinian territory, leaves on the Israeli side arable land, control over the main water resources of the region, and also the pleasant suburbs of Israeli cities, Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, big infrastructure projects connecting them to Israel. So Israel will take that over. It'll take over the Jordan Valley, from which Palestinians are being excluded and Israeli settlements are going up. That essentially imprisons what's left. Also, there are salients cutting through. One big one to the east of Jerusalem. It actually started in the 70s, but it developed mostly under Bill Clinton. That one pretty much partitions the West Bank, north and south. There's a big Israeli town, Ma'ale Adumim, which has borders going almost to Jericho, meaning if you look at the map, it virtually partitions the West Bank. There are two more salients farther north, which break up the rest of the region, and there's substantial expansion around what's called Jerusalem. Jerusalem, remember, is not Jerusalem. Jerusalem was vastly expanded by Israel when it occupied it. It's probably 5 times its original size, settled with Jewish settlers. That's doubly illegal. Not only is it in violation of Security Council orders and World Court decisions with regard to settlement altogether, but it's in violation of specific Security Council resolutions related to Jerusalem, which actually the U.S. Signed on to at that time. They were back in the late 60s when the U.S. was still part of the world on this issue. So that's multiply illegal, but it continues before our eyes. Open the papers every day, you see new development going on there. So that big area, Israel has in fact annexed in violation of the Security Council orders, and then comes the rest of what I described. That leaves to Palestinians a little over 50% of the territory. Right now it's about 40%, which is essentially unviable. I mean, there can be development, say, in Ramallah with European money coming in, so elite groups can live in, relatively well, and bars, theaters, good, nice residences. In other words, a standard neo-colonial arrangement in which elites live reasonably well, the cooperative elites, and the rest, it's their problem. They suffer. There's a military force now, security force, it's trained by a U.S. General Dayton, with the cooperation of Israel and the Jordanian dictatorship, and its main goal is to control the Arab population of the West Bank. That's doing a pretty good job. For example, during the attack on Gaza, the U.S. and Israel expected some reaction in the West Bank to this devastating attack last year, 2 years ago. There were no demonstrations in support, and the reason is they were suppressed. They were suppressed by the Dayton Army, the Palestinian Security Force, which also, arrested people who might protest and so on. In fact, the suppression was so effective that General Dayton himself informed the U.S. that Israel was able to dispatch forces from the West Bank for the attack on Gaza, freed up forces, because the Dayton Army had the situation under control. That was very impressive to U.S. leaders, like Senator Kerry, our senator, who heads the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and is kind of Obama's point man for the Middle East region. He gave an important speech in which he said that at last, after many years, Israel has a legitimate negotiating partner, namely the Palestinian Authority, and the prime reason was the Dayton Army. And now there's an army trained by the U.S. together with Israel and Jordan, which is capable of controlling the population. So now there's a legitimate negotiating partner with whoever will be willing to effectively capitulate to U.S.-Israeli demands. That's the U.S. position. That's the position of the Obama administration being implemented before our eyes. Not a big secret, or it shouldn't be. There's also a policy for Gaza. Starting in 1991, Israel made the decision that there's no point holding on to Gaza. It had already been virtually ruined under Israeli occupation, so let's forget about it. And they began to separate Gaza from the West Bank. For now almost 20 years, there has been a dedicated U.S.-Israeli policy to separate Gaza from the West Bank, split Palestine in two. That's in direct violation of the Oslo agreements, signed at about the same time, which declared that the West Bank and Gaza are a territorial unity. But again, the boss can do what he likes. We can sign a treaty agreement and celebrate it and decide to violate it. Who cares? As long as people are quiet and don't do anything about it, and that means us, for example, specifically. And the policy has continued. It's extended through these years, often very violently. I won't go through the details. It took a big step forward in January 2006. January 2006, the Palestinians committed a major crime and have to suffer for it. What happened in January 2006 is there was a free election, actually the first and only free election in the Arab world, carefully monitored, determined to be free and fair. But the Palestinians did something quite criminal. They voted the wrong way. They voted in favor of Hamas, which the U.S. opposes. Well, we're all in favor of elections when they come out the way we want. Otherwise, we're against them. That's a policy not just for this region, but overwhelmingly. I mean, the evidence for that is, I'll talk about it if you like afterwards, but it's just overwhelming. It's essentially the case that the U.S. supports democracy if and only if it accords with strategic and economic objectives. That's much as recognized even by conservative scholarship. And this is a case in point, a dramatic case in point. Elections came out the wrong way. Within days, the United States and Israel determined publicly to punish the Palestinians for this crime of voting the wrong way in a free election. And the punishment was pretty severe. Substantial siege, a lot of violence, attacks. It went so far as cutting off the supply of fresh water for the arid Gaza Strip. Well, continued on like that. July 2007 got much worse. What happened is that the U.S. tried to, with Palestinian support, Palestinian Authority support, tried to carry out a military coup to overthrow the elected government. The coup was preempted, and it didn't work, and Hamas took total control of the Gaza Strip. Well, that was considered an incredible crime. You can't, how dare you block a U.S. military coup to try to overthrow an elected government? and the siege tightened. It became much harsher. There's a real ongoing, continuing humanitarian crisis there of an enormous, at an enormous level. In June 2008, there was, meanwhile, Hamas and other groups were starting to fire primitive rockets across the border. Okay, that's a criminal act, but by comparison with everything else that's going on, it's minuscule. But that's, of course, what we talk about. There was a ceasefire in June 2008 between Israel and Hamas. The terms of the ceasefire were that Hamas would end rocket firing and that Israel would lift the siege. A siege is an act of war. It's not controversial either. In fact, Israel, of all countries, absolutely insists on this. Israel went to war twice, aggressive war, 1956 and 1967. One of the main pretexts was that Israeli access to the outside world was hampered, not stopped, but hampered by closing the Straits of Tiran, which could be Egyptian territory. That's debatable. So then they went to war. So yes, a siege is undoubted. A full siege, like on Gaza, is obviously an act of war, and it's very brutal. The fishing boats are driven to shore where they can't fish because Israel has destroyed the power and sewage plants, so contamination is horribly contaminated. Palestinians are driven away from the border. If anyone goes in there and say to farm his land, it could be killed. And just constant attacks and the cutting off of all but the bare means of life. In fact, as Israel has stated, they don't want to kill all the people. They just want to keep them on a diet, just enough to survive. The siege, the treaty was, the agreement in June 2006 was Hamas would end the rocket attacks, Israel would lift the siege, open the territory up. Well, Hamas lived up to the agreement 100%. Israel recognizes officially, you can find it on the government website, that there were no Hamas rockets fired. Israel, however, did not live up to it. It maintained the siege. Nevertheless, Hamas lived up to it. In November 2008, the day of the U.S. election, Israeli forces invaded Gaza, killed half a dozen militants, and at that point, rocket fire resumed both ways. Rocket fire from Hamas, Israeli attacks. People were killed, all of them Palestinian, but that's the normal ratio. The ceasefire ended in December. Hamas called for the ceasefire to be renewed. Israel considered the offer, rejected it, decided instead to attack. Notice that that attack has been condemned by the human rights organizations, by the Goldstone Report, and others, as being disproportionate, which is true. It was wildly disproportionate. In fact, it was major crimes. But that's kind of missing the point. If one bullet had been fired across the border by Israel, it would have also been a crime. Constant rhetoric about this, which is correct, is that Israel has a right of self-defense, which it certainly does. Everyone has a right of self-defense.